live to be an executive in some top level company, and then all of a sudden they retire. Their whole belief, their whole system of operating was reinforced or kind of developed or built and continually structured on this whole sense of self-worth through that sort of view of how they saw themselves kind of operating in that job. And then all of a sudden you take that away, and now there's a bit of a challenge to that. Now there's a loss of, I'm worthless. Just, I have no sense of purpose. Maybe there's some depression that follows. Maybe there's some isolation, right? So we can kind of see that if that's the belief and the value that somebody places on themselves, and now that's now taken away from them, there may be a now what we consider more of a dysfunctional way of thinking about that. Does that make sense? Okay. So ultimately, what I think we're hoping to get at here is that schemas influence how we process information. Okay? These cognitive schemas influence ultimately how we think, how we feel, and how we behave. And so that's really the core fundamental difference when we're talking about some of these other cognitive-based theories, or cognitive behavioral theory or behavioral-based theory. Okay? So during psychological distress, cognitive distortions are usually present. And these cognitive distortions, there's a bunch of them, and I'm not going to go through all of them. I think many of you in here already know them. But when you hear of cognitive distortion, these are going to be things that are going to come out to play that are automatic thinking processes that we respond to based upon the information that we're receiving from the environment around us. So an all or nothing thinking might be that if I don't get an A on this test, I'm ultimately a failure. Okay? If I don't do well on this clinical vignette, I'm going to fail this class. Okay? Those sorts of things. Selective abstraction, taking things out of context, even though there's other information to point out that in fact that may not be the case. So if you have a high-level athlete, they make one bad play, now they think that they're horrible, when in fact there's a whole history of them having phenomenal plays on many occasions. Okay? Mind reading, thinking about what someone else is trying to think about us or them. Negative prediction, when someone believes something bad is going to happen, but there's really no evidence to support that. So maybe if I fail an exam, though someone has studied really hard and done well on previous tests. That might be an example of a negative prediction. Predicting that something bad's going to happen when there's really no evidence to support that. Okay? Magnification or minimization, pretty self-explanatory. Magnifying a problem, blowing it completely out of proportion, or minimizing and almost accepting it as not really true, when in fact it is true. Someone's dying of cancer, but oh, she's sick and she'll get better. Okay, that might be a minimization of the problem. And all of these serve a function in some capacity, right? Another one might be personalization, assigning external situations to oneself without evidence to support it. So maybe you're waving at a stranger in a crowd and they don't wave back to you, and then you think that, oh, I did something to offend this person. When in fact there's probably a million other reasons why that person, maybe they didn't see you, maybe it was too loud, whatever. Okay? Catastrophizing, blowing things or exaggerating it to the point of becoming fearful. Overgeneralizing, I think we kind of all understand what that might be. Labeling or mislabeling, these would be negative views of self created by self-labeling based upon past errors or mistakes. So if I had an awkward encounter with a peer in the past, now I think I'm a loser. Instead of it just acknowledging that maybe I was uncomfortable. Okay? That might be where we see that labeling, mislabeling, distortion come out like that. So those are cognitive distortions that are played out through these automatic thought processes that are based upon our cognitive schemas, which ultimately house our worldviews, our belief systems, all of those things, right? Can we start to see that connection? I hope. Well, here's a little bit of a model to help us kind of put this into practice. So early childhood experiences are really the place that we start to form our belief systems, okay? And so our schemas are developed from there, and our schemas are ultimately what house that. Okay, our cognitive schemas house those beliefs. And then some critical incident happens, whatever that might be. Let's say in this case it was some sort of traumatic event. Then there's an automatic activation of those schemas that are at play. Okay? And those automatic thoughts come out, which directly influence how we feel, how we behave, and ultimately how we respond. Does that make sense? Okay. So, if cognitive theory holds that individuals' experiences shape these basic beliefs about themselves, others, and the world, which began at this young age and continue through adulthood, and if cognitive schemas are sort of structured or housed, or if these beliefs are housed in these cognitive schemas, then we can sort of work through a way in which we might see that start to play out. So if I experience love and support from my parents, then I might form a belief system that I'm lovable, I am worthy, right? I'm a good person, those sorts of things. And so there's a general sense, there's a positive view of myself. And the opposite may be true if somebody has different earlier childhood experiences. That makes sense, right? And so they may develop to be a little more negative views. They may be a little less secure in those experiences as a result of that. So, if moral injury may then occur, if we're thinking about it based upon that sort of model and that foundation, when someone holds a more positive view of themselves, okay, and relational schemas, I'm a good person, the world is a good place, children are being protected, that are then challenged by directly or indirectly experiencing a situation that's incongruent with that. So if I used any one of those examples that I gave earlier, those would be in direct conflict with my belief system and the way that I've developed my schemas, my cognitive schemas. So we can start to see how moral injury may play out as a result of that, right? If all of these things hold true, then there's going to be some reaction, probably more negatively and more long-term. And so some examples of that might be shooting a child, being raped by a senior ranking officer or member, civilian casualties, giving an order to kill, those types of things. So what we ultimately see from this perspective, this cognitive perspective, is that we're unable to reconcile these traumatic experiences with these developed schemas and held beliefs. And so ultimately, we have these cognitive distortions and distressing psychological symptoms that follow as a result of that. Okay? And so some of these distressing psychological symptoms might be these nightmares, these intrusive memories, thoughts, extreme guilt and shame, which ultimately are going to lead us to these behaviors that are initiated to manage or relieve discomfort, which might be things like avoidance, right? If those are the experiences that you're having, then that avoidance or substance use are going to be the behavior that are going to follow. Okay, so that's a way in which we can look at moral injury from this perspective. While we're looking at it purely from a cognitive theory perspective, it is much as relevant to moral injury conceptually in the literature still. Because moral injury and PTSD conceptually are based upon a social cognitive model. So, how many of you guys know of social cognitive? Right? Tell me about it. What is that? I'm a little off topic, but it's important because it gives context to why it still applies. What is a social cognitive model? Theory. What does that say? Yeah.
It's to say that we develop our cognitive schemas and the way that we think largely based on those around us and by our environment and social surroundings.
Totally, right? That there's more of a learning component to how we develop the way that we start to think and feel and those types of things, right? So, but the cognitive component is still inherently important in how we understand that. And so the same thing is true when we're talking about moral injury. That's no less important and it's no less emphasized. In fact, it's probably emphasized a little bit more, maybe in some regards. Are there any questions? Any questions about that? Does that make sense as to how we kind of get there from this sort of way to how we understand moral injury? We're on the same page. What are your thoughts about that when you hear that? Okay, I'll come back to you at the end. Talk about it at the very end. There's I actually forgot to take it out, but since it's in there, that's fine. So there are some questionnaires, assessments that exist on moral injury. There's two in particular. The moral injury event scale is one of them. There's another one that exists, but they're still really being fleshed out because conceptually we don't really understand moral injury yet. Part of that is because there is this confounding effect on how we understand moral injury conceptually, because much of how we understand moral injury overlaps with PTSD. And it's very hard to take some of those specific things that we laid out there, guilt, shame, and isolation, when we can't yet differentiate it conceptually from PTSD. Does that make sense? So because of that, there's this overlap that exists, so it becomes difficult to specifically screen for moral injury when there's so many other variables that overlap with PTSD. Okay? But there is some assessments that do exist out there. They're gaining pretty good traction. There's still some more work to be done. But William Nash, Dr. Nash, is kind of a big leader in this space. He's a psychiatrist, and so he's really big in this world right here. So, yeah. Okay. So that sort of takes us to treatment. So if we know moral injury exists, which it does, we know it's a thing, we know people have some pretty strong isolated experiences that are different from PTSD, then it would make sense that we can't treat moral injury the same way we treat PTSD, right? There's a different way we have to do that. However, moral injury is not explicitly addressed in current evidence-based treatments for PTSD, and I kind of talked about that already, right? And that's partly due that PTSD is theoretically built on this fear-based or danger-based foundation, this danger-based, fear-based response. Diagnostically, that's how you diagnose and recognize PTSD, right? It's something that drives fear or danger every step of the way. There's a lot of things that follow, but that's the core essence of it. So moral injury doesn't. It's not a fear-based response. It's a very different response, right? As we kind of highlighted in some of those examples. Giving an order to do something and then innocent people being killed as a result of that, but then having extreme feelings of guilt and shame and regret and re-experiencing of that decision is not driven by fear. That's driven by something totally different that we're still trying to really figure out what that is. Okay? However, the approaches of prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy have made suggestions in how we can target those core elements of moral injury, like guilt and shame, which in turn can help contextualize those experiences with various cognitive models that exist. And we talked about social learning theory, or social cognitive theory is what it's called now, right? That's how these treatments, prolonged exposure, cognitive processing therapy, those are built on the theoretical foundation of social cognitive theory. But the cognitive component is still an extremely important component to that. So understanding that, they've been able to start to look at ways in which they can, I don't want to say modify, but adapt some of those treatments to target a little bit more of that guilt and shame.